Okay, guys, so we're going to take a look at the United States after the War of 1812 and how that war was considered the second independence for the United States. It did bring about a sense of unity within the United States, which we typically call the age of nationalism. So we're going to take a look at how nationalism started to be perceived in particularly in the economy. So how we are trying to grow our nation and keep a balance between the growing sectionalism between the industrial North and the agricultural South. So, the rise in nationalism in the economy. The beginning of our industrial age really stemmed from competition with Great Britain. So, you might recall last year from World II learning about the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Great Britain has started to use some of the very first factories and creating the concept of mass production. So, starting to get rid of those little mom and pop shops or in home, like the cottage system, where families would work together to make their products by hand, but instead starting to come up with machines and ways of production that would increase production, but also those machines would speed up the process for production. And so the idea of that mass production, the more that you are able to make of something, the less expensive that it is, and the more that you're going to be able to sell. So being able to produce those goods in those large quantities. So the impact that this is going to have on the United States is the fact that we started to realize how dependent we were on Great Britain and France and really foreign trade. After the American Revolution, the main component of our economy was our foreign trade. Internally, we are very much an agrarian society. So we were selling tobacco and indigo and rice and sugar. We were selling those abroad in Europe and in Great Britain in the West Indies. But as our trade started to be disrupted, and with the creation of the Embargo Act in 1807 by Thomas Jefferson, we then realized that our whole economy kind of came to a halt when we could no longer trade with Great Britain or really any other country at that time. We also recognized that we were not self-sufficient. We could not manufacture all of the goods that we needed, that we were importing from Great Britain and all those other countries. So by 1809, we're going to see a lot of our ports and a lot of our distribution areas pretty much out of work, which was primarily in the New England region. Then we start to get things up and running after the Embargo Act is revoked in 1809, but then comes the War of 1812. And so once again, Great Britain forms a blockade along our coastline, and again, we're not able to conduct our foreign trade. So after the War of 1812, our politicians and really our entire society realizes that we need to change our economic system where we are not so heavily dependent on foreign trade, and we need to look at ourselves internally, which is what brings about this rise and sense of nationalism, that the United States needs to be its own self-sufficient nation. So the Industrial Revolution is going to really start to take hold in the New England region, where a lot of those port cities were that found themselves out of work. It was the natural inclination and natural place for the Industrial Revolution to take place. So Samuel Slater is going to be the one to bring about our first major factory in the United States. So he was able to produce thread. Okay, so our textile region, our textile area is going to be focusing in the New England area. So Samuel Slater brought the idea from Great Britain with him and started to implement it in the New England region. Then we have Lowell, and this is where Lowell and two other partners find a way to mechanize all stages of producing cloth. And so this mass production of cloth will also give us an edge in the textile industry. And so they created their first factory town. Within the territory, they're able to build up factories. They also build housing for their local workers, which most of the workers that came were mostly young girls from local farms in the northern region who were looking for work as their families are trying to get by. And so the changes within this factory are going to help spur the idea of the Industrial Revolution, really the early Industrial Revolution in the United States. So this is what's going on in the North, a focus on industry, particularly textile industry, with thread and cloth, which means there's going to be a demand for cotton. So switching gears into the Southern region, they're not looking to make the manufacturing centers, but they're going to continue with their agrarian society. And since there's a demand in our textile industry for cotton, that's what they're looking to grow. Now, cotton, many farmers, many plantation owners and small scale farmers had tried to grow cotton in the South. The easiest type of cotton was long stem cotton. But the problem is the long staple cotton really didn't produce a quality bud. The better quality cotton that grew better within the region was short staple cotton. The problem is the short staple cotton, it was difficult to extract the seeds from the cotton, so it was very difficult to make a profit. Well, in comes Eli Whitney and his new invention, the cotton gin. So Eli Whitney had helped with the increase of mass production in the New England region with his concept of interchangeable parts, where you make essentially the base of a machine and you can take certain parts out and put new parts in, and the machine will be able to perform in a different function. He used this idea, he kind of got this idea from the roll of muskets. So then he comes up with his cotton gin or cotton engine, and this is going to revolutionize the South. It allowed for more cotton to be produced in the short staple format, because you can look at the picture there up in the opening little flap, you can see the cotton going in, and you turn the crank and it separates the threads of the cotton for the seeds to be able to fall out. And from there you're able to have nice clean cotton that can then be turned into thread, which then can be spun into cloth and sold abroad. So short staple cotton, much easier to be grown and easier to produce in the South. So the cotton gin is going to have a lot of positive effect. It actually encourages some of our expansion into our new Western territory. Many farmers who now realize that they can make a lot of money off of cotton, especially with our growing textile industry in New England, that we can start settling on that land and start planting the short staple cotton. And so this is going to encourage people to move west of the Appalachian Mountains, south of Ohio, and encourage westward growth into what is present day Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, and the Missouri region, because they're going to take up that land to start growing the cotton. A negative impact, though, of the cotton gin, and actually something that Eli Whitney was hoping to eliminate, was the demand for slave labor. He was thinking that the cotton gin would replace the slave laborers who had the task of taking the seeds out of the cotton buds. But unfortunately, as more cotton is being grown, it has to be planted, it has to be harvested, and the cotton gins have to be used and the cotton to be baled up and sold. So it's actually going to increase the demand for slaves on these new growing plantations. And so this essentially is going to cement the institution of slavery even further in the United States economy and in the Southern culture. Now, there was some growing concern amongst our politicians about some sectional division that was starting to rise. We're starting to see the emphasis of industry and factories and mass production in our New England region, with the focus on our textile mills and textile industry. Where in the South, we see the agrarian society continuing with the production of cotton and other cash crop systems. So one thing that we realized during the War of 1812 is that our country needs to try to remain unified as much as possible. So in 1815, President Madison, after kind of the War of 1812, is going to present a plan to Congress. And with this agenda, he's hoping to unite the different regions. So they're starting to recognize we're building textiles in New England. We have the supply of the product cotton in the South. So we need to find a means to connect these regions so that they are dependent on one another and we become a self-sufficient nation. And so with this plan, he proposed that we need to develop new transportation systems with some internal improvements so that we can transport our goods back and forth, to establish a protective tariff. Now, tariffs have been a concern in the past, but Madison was starting to realize that tariffs were needed for our young industries to be able to compete with the foreign countries who had been manufacturing cloth and textile much longer than the United States. And as much as Madison didn't like it the first time, he does realize that we need to resurrect the national bank. We need a unifying, organizing agency, essentially, or banking system that will be able to monitor our trade and the production and transportation between the regions. And so even though Madison had his critics in Congress, some of his largest critics happened to be Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. They actually support Madison in this plan. And Henry Clay coins the phrase, the American system. So Madison's agenda: unite the different regions to create a strong, stable economy. Clay and Calhoun give their support. They were amongst his harshest critics. Clay promoted it as, quote, the American system. And so those three major points that they're going to focus on is transportation. How are we going to, get the goods to the manufacturing centers, and then the final products to the markets to be sold. The protective tariffs to allow our industries to grow, and then that national bank, which will help manage the trade and communication between the two regions. And so looking at that first tariff in 1816, that protective tariff that is going to be created to protect our industries. So again, tax on imports that would increase the cost of foreign goods. It would make American goods cheaper. Tariff revenues would help pay for the internal improvements. So they realize when we get to transportation that it's going to cost money. So we have to be able to generate that revenue, generate that money to build the roads or the canals or even eventually railroads that will help connect the various regions of the country. So in the North, they really welcome this relief. They're trying to get their industries up and running. The Industrial Revolution in Britain had taken place first, so their textile mills were up and running, and their cloth was much cheaper. So they are looking forward to this tariff to make them competitive on the market, protected their manufacturing centers. The South and West are still a bit critical of the tariffs. They resented the government intervention that made the goods more expensive. Because these farmers were, only making a certain amount of income, they felt forced to have to buy the more expensive American goods, realizing that without this tariff, the British cloth would be less expensive. But again, the tariff is going to generate revenue, which in turn is going to be pumped back into the American system to increase transportation amongst the regions. And so we're going to see two major innovations come about. One is the national road. So this is our federally funded highway. Today, highways are maintained by states. It's considered a reserve power of the states. But in this essence, the federal government was trying to get the American system up and running, so they get Congress to try to fund the federally funded national road. It's going to start in Maryland and travel all the way to Illinois. And so the thought process here was starting to connect our regions of the East Coast, trying to get to our port cities, into our Western territory across the Appalachian Mountains. And so having a national road would be a safe plan of travel. Then comes the Great Big Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal got the nickname the Big Ditch, because it was 363 miles in length, and it was dug by men. The key to the Erie Canal was that it connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, which essentially is going to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. And so we will have a whole new system of transportation in our Ohio River Valley region to be able to transport those goods across the mountains to the Atlantic and potentially off to Europe or even the West Indies.